Hey everybody, this is Matt from Matt's Fantasy Book Reviews, and today I am back with the countdown of my top 100 fantasy books of all time. Today we're going through number 50 to 41, and I can't wait to share them all with you. Before we get started, I have got some complaints from people that these videos are lasting way too long. So I'm going to do every single thing in my power to keep this video under 30 minutes. So if you see this video being over 30 minutes, then I'm sorry I messed up, but I guarantee it will not be. So let's start it up with number 50, and that is The Fires of Heaven by Robert Jordan. This is part of The Wheel of Time, written in 1993, and this is book number 5 of 15. And I kept saying this in this series, but I felt like these first 5 books were each better than the last. And so I thought The Fires of Heaven was just amazing because I really was invested and loved my journey into the Wheel of Time by this far into the series. I knew that it was going to be a wonderful series for me. And this book had so much going for it that some of the others didn't have. You know, I felt like this was the first Wheel of Time book that didn't really have any boring sections. Now, I know boring sounds like a really negative term, and it very much is, but for me, I thought that the Wheel of Time benefited by having some of these slower sections, but this book didn't really have those moments. Every single aspect of this book I thoroughly enjoyed. You know, I loved that the focus on this book, or not the focus, but there was a lot greater focus on the ale people. And I might be saying that wrong. I've never heard it out loud. I've only read it. But this is like the desert people. I have been enamored by this group of people for so long when I got into this series, and I still remember them with such fondness. In fact, it's some of the better memories I have of reading this entire series. You know, I feel like everybody has their own thing about this book that really called to them, and that was mine. I love the history of them. I loved the way that they interact with each other. I loved their more tribal nature and how they weren't this completely unified people, and they had this deep past, this past that had so much division in them, and it led to some very entertaining aspects of this book. It had this amazing history that led toward this amazing future for the rest of for them in the books, and for the characters that interacted with them. So every time that we got invested with these people, I just thought it was amazing. You know, they're just these awesome warriors that have this enormous like fighting culture that is just so cool. And I love the different dynamics of what makes them so unique. And it's such a picture perfect example of what the world building and why it was so magical in the Wheel of Time is that Robert Jordan was able to create this world with so many different people that you could be enamored with, that it really felt like bigger than life. And it really came to life here. And that's why I will always say that I think every book series has something that it's like the best at. And I feel like the Wheel of Time, and this is a big thing to say it's the best at, but I think it had the best world building out of any series that I've ever read. Now, I have criticisms with a lot of the Wheel of Time, but the world building is just so perfect. And this book did it magnificently. You know, it was noticeably absent of Perrin in this book. Perrin didn't show up, I don't think, at all, if I'm remembering correctly. He went off to do his own thing, and I don't want to explain what that is, because I don't want to ruin anything, because his storyline, when we do get to him, was amazing. And I love that we got that pullback from his character so that it made it a lot more impactful when we got to him, because I think Robert Jordan did something really cool here with the way that he structured his books. He didn't need to do the thing that's really popular right now, where you bounce back and forth between these different characters. And so you'll get kind of this dynamic where you have, you know, let's say you have 5 POV characters, you know, A, B, C, D, E, and then we'll go back to A, B, C, D, and E. No, what he did was he said, let's go spend a lot of chapters on one story arc. And when we finish up, not completely wrapping up the arc, because none of them really get wrapped up until the end of the series, but once we tell us this individual story, we'll move on to another one, and we'll spend a good chunk of time dealing with that. And I love that. I wish more books would do this, and I get why they don't. You know, the cliffhangers is a really popular thing. It keeps you on the edge of your seat, and ultimately it gets people addicted to reading more. But I thought it worked so much better when you did this Robert Jordan thing. And I need more authors to do this. I love it. And quite frankly, this is a thing that exists in a lot of the Wheel of Time, and you're going to hear quite a number of Wheel of Time books that I even like more than this one, where that was a similar structure to those books. So yeah, if you're not into the Wheel of Time and you feel like daunted by it, to realize that this is amazing and that it's got to be something that hooks you, and it takes a little while to get to that point. Number 49 is Feet of Clay by Terry Pratchett. This is a Discworld book written in 1996, and it is book number 19 of 41. But it's number 3 of 8 of the City Watch subseries. And I'll just quickly recap that the Discworld you do not have to read in chronological order. In fact, you shouldn't. You can read these little mini series that are within it that have their own self-contained, longer plot lines. So in this one, 8 of the books are City Watch, and you can read them all back to back to back to back. I don't think you should do that, though, because the City Watch books are the best of the bunch, and you'll just get rid of the best books all at once. And then it'd be better to kind of space them out a little bit, but you should start with the City Watch series to really get invested in this. I thought this book in particular, Feet of Clay, was possibly the funniest Discworld book that ever got written, which puts it in the running for the funniest book of all time, because Discworld is known for being hysterical. I thought this book in particular was like the literary version of Naked Gun. And Naked Gun did this amazing thing where it didn't really try to do the hardest laughs of all time, even though some of the hardest I've ever laughed was in Naked Gun movies. But it tried to give you a high laughs per minute, where this book did that. It felt like every single page, or at least every other page, had some sort of comedic aspect going on. And so while not all of them hit, so many of them did, that you just couldn't stop smiling and getting ready for what the next one was going to be. But what makes Terry Pratchett so special for me is that he's not just this comedy writer and doing satires on things, but he also mixes in this really healthy dose of philosophical musings. So to be able to contrast that philosophical nature of talking about these more deep subjects on one hand, and then making you laugh really hard on the other, is really, really special. And so in this book, one of the major things that he's talking about is slavery. And to make you laugh in a book about slavery is very special. And very often in Discworld books, when he talks about something in real life, he uses these fantasy elements to tell that story in a different way. And slavery here is this idea that golems, which are these clay created creatures that are very much not alive, they're made out of clay. All of a sudden they're starting to get more sentience, and people are starting to treat them like they're human, and they want to have their own freedom. And that's a big theme of this story. Now this story in particular is a mystery at its heart. You don't know exactly who caused the crime. There's crimes that are trying to be solved here. And we're marching towards that goal throughout. But ultimately, most Discworld books, a vast majority of Discworld books, the stories are just okay. That's not why I think most people come back to the Discworld books. Now, some people are probably going to hear what I just said and say, blasphemy. But for me, the stories are just okay. What makes them good is the ability to laugh, the ability to talk about deep subjects, the high writing quality, and mixing in this amazing spin on what we think of as traditional fantasy elements and playing with them in different ways. In this book, some of the things that I'll always remember about this book is that it followed this trend of adding more members to the Watch. And when the book started in Guards, there was only 4 members of the Watch. But at this point, there's quite a number of them, because the Watch is in its resurgence phase. It's becoming more popular, and people want to join it. And here you get some amazing new people joined in the Watch. You have werewolves, and you have lady dwarves, which are so funny to me, because dwarves are, in this series, are all masculine. Even the women dwarves grow beards, and they all dress identical. But in this book, you have kind of this womanly coming out story, kind of reminiscing on women earlier on in American history or world history, when they felt more comfortable wearing dresses and putting on lipstick. And in these, you have these dwarves, and they're doing the same thing. They want to wear dresses, they want to wear lipstick. and they're getting outcast or looked down upon from the others in the dwarf world, and it's a really funny take on things and extremely entertaining. And you also have these gargoyles that join the watch, and they're just so good at standing still in one place and watching forever. And so there's so many funny things about these books. I can't put into words what makes these funny. You just have to give it a shot, because my comedic value is about 1/1000th what Sir Terry Pratchett has. So don't be daunted by the fact that this series is 41 books long. You don't have to read them all. Very few people actually do. Pick up one. Pick up Guards and see what you think. I almost guarantee you're going to love it. Number 48 is Fool's Assassin by Robin Hobb. This is part of the realm of the Elderlings, written in 2014, and this is book 14 of 16, and it's book 1 of 3 of the final trilogy in the realm of the Elderlings, and that is The Fitz and the Fool. A trilogy that I'd say most people would agree is either the best trilogy in this set or the second best, and this is where it started. I can't reveal too much about what the plot is, because so many books have happened up to leading to this point that I would ruin so much, but I can say some basic things. A major aspect to all of these books is the character Fitz. Fitz is a feature in 9 of the 16 books. And in this part, he has grown. He's an older man he's went from like a little boy in the first book to this stage where he's in the final stage of his life. He's got a family, he's had so much tragic loss in his life, and he's just trying to move on with his life. But he gets called back into action. And I can't say any more than that, but I love so dearly this idea that we got to see the growth of this one character over time. I love well-executed time jumps. I just got done reviewing Greenbone Saga, and they did this time jump in an amazing way, all in one book. But in this series, you get these major time jumps between the trilogies, and it's so fun to read this character, and you feel like you're growing up with this character. And it leads so much to you having this emotional investment with Fitz that will never go away. He'll always go down as one of my favorite characters in all of fantasy, not just because of the writing quality, and the writing quality is amazing, but because of this character growth that we got to see in these amazing time jumps. This book had huge stakes, and the emotions are super high. But what's interesting here is it is a slower book, and it's interesting to have this dynamic of high stakes, but a slower plot. And I really enjoy slower plots, especially in the first book in a trilogy, because I think it sets things up so well to be able to knock all the pins down later on. And the series very much did execute that as the series went along. The world building here was interesting, in that I normally give high scores to world building when they're bigger. The bigger, the better. And the world building couldn't have been more narrow here. 95% of the book takes place in a very small single location. In fact, like in a single home. And I cherished it for that. I could so perfectly visualize where everything in this book happened, and it really filled out so much of this story for me. And I thought that it just transported me here with these characters. And I think the world building was incredible, even though we didn't get to adventure outside of an extremely small location. I thought it was wonderful. I also have criticized in the past the magic system in Realm of the Elderlings. It's my least favorite part of the Realm of the Elderlings, but it was amazing here, because in the whole series you have 2 different magic systems. You have one which is the wit, and the wit is essentially where you can communicate and have these deep bonds with animals. You get like an animal companion who you can communicate with and kind of see from their eyes, and all these amazing magical capabilities with them. And then you also have the skill, and the skill is an interesting thing, but essentially it's like, mind magic, where you can communicate with people from long distances, you can kind of telepathically attack people. But in this one, a third is introduced, and in a very cool way. There's a character that gets introduced that has this deeper power, and to be able to investigate that power was very fun. And I thought it was the best magic system in this entire series, and it really amplified my enjoyment for this book because of what it did. I ultimately will look back on this with immensely fond memories. This is going to be one of my top Realm of the Elderlings books. We're certainly going to see more, but yeah, I think that a lot of people that will read this book have been jaded going into this because everybody agrees that the quartet of books leading up to this one were by far the weakest in these entire 16 books. In fact, some of the worst stuff I've ever read was a couple of the books in that quartet. And a lot of people probably bounced out from this series as they were reading that. But I urge you to keep on going. Finish up those books and get to this amazing conclusion, because these books are so emotionally impactful as they go along that you will regret dropping this series when you're already so invested. And if you must, then at least just read a synopsis and then move on to these. I don't think you should. I think you should get through them, because I think the ending of that quartet was actually rather good. But yeah, you got to get to these books. They're extremely special. Number 47 is A Time of Courage by John Gwynne. This is part of Blood and Bone, and this was written in 2020. It's book 3 of 3. And I've talked a lot about this series over the past year or so, and I am obsessed with not only this Of Blood and Bone series, but its predecessor, The Faithful and the Fallen. In fact, if you were to combine these two series into one, this would be one of my top 3 favorite series of all time. It's so wonderful, and I can't go over too much about what this plot is about, because this is the last book in a trilogy, and I'll ruin so much, but let me hit on some of the basic points. This series is essentially a story about angels versus demons that have come back from the heavens to inhabit this land again, and bringing the mortals on Earth into this greater fight of good and evil. And that's essentially the story of the first quartet as well, of Faithful and the Fallen. But as we felt like the first series had a conclusion to it, it turns out that it's a little bit more complicated than that. And drama has risen up again into this series. And at this point in the trilogy, it is down to the final battle of good versus evil. And this time it's for real. And I know it feels kind of like a cop-out, but because the first one didn't really end, but it worked really well. And the story is quite a bit different than the first quartet, in that this is kind of a more gray story. You're not quite sure exactly if the good guys are the good guys or the bad guys are the bad guys. You get a sense of it, but there's a lot more drama involved in terms of the blending of these lines. I love that this book had so much built up to it. Not only did it need to finish out this trilogy really well, but it had to finish up this larger story really well. And it did extremely amazing at achieving what it was able to achieve. It had this wonderful mix of predictable and unpredictable to make a truly memorable story. There was some amazing twists here, some twists that really made me my jaw actually hit the floor, especially towards the end of this book, that were really fun to read about in a really exciting way. And I won't say anything more than that, but I really enjoyed the twists that were involved here. I also really loved in this book in particular, but we no longer in this series do we have these kind of frenetic shifting of points of view. John Gwynne, in a lot of books prior to this, did this common thing that's kind of the opposite of what I was talking about, of what I enjoy about Robert Jordan earlier in this video, and that he would just shift constantly, boom, 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 shifting the points of view. And it was overdone. But in this series, you didn't get as much of that. You had some more consistent storylines. You didn't have these cliffhangers. You got to hang on to some of these point of views for longer. And in this series in particular, there's much less point of views, and so we didn't have as much of that. There's only a couple major storylines going on at any given time, because the action is all isolated to a very small portion of this map, and it worked really well for this story. Now, the thing that I think everybody will talk about when they talk about this book is the final battle that we've been leading up towards. And not only is it, in my opinion, the best battle in any single John Gwynne book, but it was so long. I mean, virtually half of this book was the stages of this final battle. And I can still perfectly envision how they all went about in my head. I'm sure everybody would paint a slightly different picture about the set pieces that they saw in their head, but it just worked so well. It was epic. It was like one of the most epic fight sequences that I've ever read in all of fantasy. It's just so amazingly well done. And if you read John Gwynne for no other reason, I think you should read it for the battle sequences. They're incredible. They're larger than life, and they're as good or better than real life battles that are being retold again. He's able to figure out this way to retell and to make up these stories, and they're so believable, even though they're involving these, epic beasts fighting against, these totally, demonic warriors and all these crazy fantasy elements, but they just feel real. But this series ends so well, and if you're one of the many people that read Faithful and the Fallen but decided not to read Of Blood and Bone, shame on you. Shame on you. Go pick up this series. You will not regret it. Number 46 is The Autumn Republic by Brian McClellan. This is the last book in the Powder Mage trilogy written in 2015. Now, the Powder Mage is split up into two separate trilogies, but they're so different that I consider them almost entirely different series, because one of them, this one, dealt with this one continent with this certain set of characters, and the next trilogy dealt with a totally different continent, totally different sequences of events that happened that are entirely disconnected from the sequence over here. And there is some character crossover, but it's very limited. So I consider them very different. Now, this trilogy I loved a lot more than the second one. And this book just wrapped it up in such an amazing way. And I know that I'm going to keep feeling this way, but I'm very sad that I have to give this book a ranking that I consider way lower than it should be. In my head, I keep thinking about, this trilogy ended up, and it's like a top 20 trilogy for me. It ended so amazing, but when I go back and I look at my rankings, it's hard for me to pick, that many books that are better than that this will be better than. So, it's tough for me, but I got to stick with this ranking. But this series was so satisfying to me. I love the Powder Mage. I think it's one of the most underrated series of all time. And I've heard a lot of actually hate for this series from people, booktubers that I really like, that have said, this series is not amazing. And I just don't know what book they were reading, because what I read here was the most close kin to the First Law that I've ever read. It had so many of the similar vibes. It kind of had this darker tone to it. It had this multi-POV with these very entertaining characters that all of them were not great people. It dealt with a very specific location on a map, that there's this much larger world where if you look at the map, it's huge, and we're only dealing with events, in this rough area, but there's all these other things going on elsewhere that we never get to learn about because the world is so big and living and breathing. And that's the same for here. Now, I can't talk too much about the plot. And we're at this point of the video sequence where a lot of these books are going to be later on in the series, and I can't really divulge too much. But the few things I can say is that this book investigated gods and the humans' relationship with gods, and gods kind of coming back in a very entertaining way. People trying to summon gods, and these gods kind of hiding out on this planet and influencing events, and it turns out they've been influencing them for a really long amount of time, and all the reveals that come along with that, and was just magnificent. The battles in this book were so fun. I thought the magic system was extremely inventive. I thought the characters were great. It's hard for me to say much that I didn't like about this book. It did everything I would say top tier. Now, I wouldn't say that there's any single thing about this book that was, greater than anything that's ever been written. But everything worked. And, and I think that's true for all of the books in this series, and I feel like they kept getting better as the series went along. So, if you read that first book and you're like, yeah, I don't love it, I think you should probably keep pushing through and work through this. Now, if you hated the first book, you're not going to like this series. But if you at least thought the first one was okay, I think you're going to really enjoy this for all of the reasons that I said. So I realize that I'm being vague. I want to keep these things super spoiler free. But if you want to talk more in depth about the series for me, and you have a bunch of questions, or you've read this and you want to go over the details, come join the Discord. There's a link down below. I'd love to chat with you about it and talk about my unfiltered thoughts about the series with you. Number 45 is another Wheel of Time book, and this one is The Shadow Rising. Again, this is by Robert Jordan. This is written in 1992, and it is book 4 of 15. Now, I realized that I said that I liked each of the 5 books that started the series more than the predecessor. And so what am I doing with book number 4 with a better ranking than book number 5? Well, the reason for that is it's when I finished up this series and I went back to think and to reevaluate my thoughts about this series, this book kept on rising with how much that I loved it. So at the time, I liked book 5 more than 4, but on reevaluation, I think book 4 is better than book 5. And in part, I think there's some nostalgia there because this was the point in the series where I fell deeply in love with the Wheel of Time. Now, that love expanded over time, but this is where I was really like, yeah, this rocks. And that did keep going, but I just got addicted by this point. I think that I was very weary going into this book that these characters were starting to split up by this point. And up to this point, you had mostly large groups of these characters sticking together. And there was some division happening. The division even started to happen in book 2. But in large part, they're in distinctive groups. Now, in this book, the split ups start really happening. And, it kind of has to happen for a book series that's like 11,000 plus pages. And that there wouldn't be enough to talk about if the same characters went to the same locations. You have to split it up to start actually investigating the world more and get more development into this story. But it worked so well. And it made me fall in love with these characters in much more depth. When these characters are in a group, it's hard sometimes, as a first-time reader, to really differentiate yourself with them, to differentiate themselves from each other. Some of their characteristics kind of blend together. But when they separate, you really get to fall in love with them individually. And that very much happened here. I thought it just worked to perfection, and you got to learn so much detail about them. This is where the alewaste really starts to develop. It still exists in the next book, and they exist throughout the rest of the series. But, there were some sequences to this book that are some of my favorite sequences that I've ever read in all of fantasy. And I actually went back and read them again after I finished up the series because of how much I liked them. And I don't do that. It's extremely rare. I finish a book, I'm never going to pick it up again until I do a reread. But I had to go back and read, especially this one chapter. There is a chapter in this book that does something that I don't know that I've ever read a book that did what this did. And that you were hearing this story, and it had linear progression throughout the story. But we went to the Ale people, and all of a sudden, Robert Jordan said, let's go back and tell a story now of the history of these people. But it didn't just do it in this, let's go back and start from A and come back to Z where we are now and tell that story. It went from Z, Y, X and backwards, where you kind of got the end of their story first, and then you kept going and going and going. And it was crazy. The revelations that happened made you fall in love and compassion and sadness for the story that happened here. And when you get to that portion of the book, sit back and cherish it, because it is extremely rare to find an author with that much skill to be able to tell a single chapter in a story that can enthrall you in a brand new story and just create some deep love, at least I did, for a brand new set of characters. It is magical and some of the best stuff that I've ever read in my entire life. The Perrin sections in particular in this book really made me fall in love with that character as well. He gets a strong focus here, and I could ruin a lot by saying where he goes and the people that he sees, but it's so fun to read this character engaging with this certain group of people and the crazy adventure they go through. And you really get this whole setup and conclusion to this story all in one, and it's extremely satisfying. I also thought that the portions that involve the White Tower here were some of the more shocking moments that have ever happened in all of fantasy for me, and I will always cherish the chapters that involve the White Tower here. There's a lot of different directions that it can go, and the direction they went was perfect in retrospect. And it set up so much of the rest of the series that, yeah, I couldn't say enough more positive things about it. So, yeah, this book rocks, and it's one of my favorite Robert Jordan books. Number 44 is Valor. This is again by John Gwynne, and this is book 2 of The Faithful and the Fallen out of 4, and this is written in 2014. Oh man, this book is just incredible. This took everything that got set up in Malice and ramped it up to 11. It was better in every single way, and I love Malice. Malice showed up on my top 100. And literally every part of this book I thought was better. Now, Malice did the thing that I love. It was a slow burn for the first book. But by the end of that book, the hooks were so far into me that I don't remember a time when a first book has got me so invested into reading the second book as this one did. There's been a couple times. In fact, I'm going to talk about one in a couple books from now. But man, I was excited to read this, and it delivered. It started the action at high octane. And even though there's some slowdowns, the pace of this book is fast and exciting. And I love so much about what happened here. The world at this point went from this cheery, fun atmosphere to dark and grim and hopeless. Now, you know that this is essentially a good versus evil book, and clearly good is going to prevail, or at least you hope so. But at this point in the story, you have that classic thing where it feels like nothing can go right. And it makes things so much better for when eventually things do improve later on, that I love this portion of the series. There's no technically middle book to a 4-book series, but there is certainly no middle book syndrome here. It's just awesome. This feels very similar to me with A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, it's not the same series. It's very different. But I routinely will say that people that love A Song of Ice and Fire, I think will also love The Faithful and the Fallen for very similar reasons. You have this awesome epic scale. You have this very, very intriguing characters with this political intrigue that's constantly happening. This very fun multi-POV where every single character is entertaining, and it's just a fun, intriguing journey that you get to go on with these characters. There's crazy action, there's insane battles, there's these super dynamic duels that happen, there's pit fights. You get way more clarity between the differences on the main two groups of people here and what make them tick, why they believe in what they believe in, what they're trying to achieve. You've got magical artifacts that people are trying to uncover. They're in an arms race to see who can get them the fastest, to be able to call their gods first, to be able to strike down the others. It's just so awesome. I want so badly to forget the series, and so I can experience this all again. I very often think that I wish I could just get a full mind wipe from everything I've ever read, so I can just go back and do it again. And Valor is one of the major reasons that I feel that way. In this whole The Faithful and the Fallen in general, I think each of those books improved upon the one previous to it, and that just tells you how much I love these next two books, and I can't wait to talk to you about them. Number 43 is The Bone Ships. This is by R.J. Barker. This is the first of the Tide Child trilogy written in 2019. And I read this book very recently, and this is one of the books that actually filled up a vacant spot in my top 100. I left a couple open spots, knowing that I'd probably read some top tier 5 out of 5s that I'd want to put in there. And The Tide Child filled that perfectly. Now, I'm actually sad because I think the next book in this series, I think it's The Call of the Bone Ships, is better than this one. But I don't have it in my list because I just ran out of spots and I ran out of time to be, you got to make decisions when you do a top 100 and lock it in at some point. But I'm keeping Tide Child in there because it's just awesome. Now, this is one of the greatest starts to a series of all time. Maybe the greatest start to a series of all time. This is a nautical fantasy pirate book. And I love all three of those terms that I just said dearly. I am a sucker for pirate books. I'm a sucker for fantasy. I'm a sucker for things involving, boats and naval fights. And this book just has it all. You've got this amazing story that's told from not the main character in this story. The main character you get to read about, but this guy in this story that's telling this story is this disgraced captain. He gets disgraced within 2 pages of the book, and he gets his boat taken from him by a much more capable captain, and he ends up being the number 2 on that boat. And you get to see it from this guy's perspective, who's this huge fall from grace, but he gets to, adore this amazing captain that you get to see from the background. And it's really fun that they chose this. You could so easily tell this story from that really main person. But I love, hard decisions sometimes that authors have to make that can be risky. And I think this risk really, really paid off. This book starts slow. Very slow, too slow for some people. In fact, a lot of people that I know that have read this book because of my recommendations have said, Matt, what are you doing here? Why are you recommending this? Yeah, it starts slow, but the end is rocking. And it clearly sets up things because the second book takes off where that first one did, much similar to what Valor did, and just amplifies everything up some. I love the world here. The world is very special. You've got this really fun dynamic of these 2 rival nations who have been fighting as long as they can remember. And the fighting seems like it's never going to stop, but it has to soon. Because in this world, there are no trees. The ships are made out of bones of deceased, sea dragons. But the sea dragons are gone. They've killed them all. And so the boats are slowly dwindling as this war goes on, and they sink ships to the point where they're going to run out of ships soon. And they're going to have to figure out some peace accord between these 2 nations if they want to actually exist. But a monster gets seen again. A sea monster is seen, and the war is going to be fresh and back on because one of these dragons can sustain many, many, many ships. And whoever gets this sea monster killed is going to be the nation to beat. And thus the tale of these people that are racing to try to kill the sea monster. But it's a lot more complicated than that. But that's all you need to know to go into this story. I think the fantasy elements are awesome. I love everything that I just told you about these sea monsters that they have to kill to get the bones. You can so visualize these ships made out of bones that they're riding and that are awesome. It's got these really fun characters that I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but it's like this half bird, half human, grotesque looking creature that can blow wind and make ships go super fast, but the power is not unlimited. They can only do so much at a time. And, it's got this marvelous character depth. The writing quality is to die for. I love so much about the way that R.J. Barker constructs the words on a page. They flow. They're just, it's poetic. It rocks. So not a ton of people have read this series, though. I think more people need to. So I hope more attention gets called to the bone ships because, man, this is awesome. Number 42, and we're going to keep rolling with this nautical theme, and this is The Mad Ship by Robin Hobb. This is part of the Realm of the Elderlings, written in 1998, and it is book 5 of 16, but it's book 2 of 3 of the Live Ship Traders trilogy, which is the second trilogy in the Realm of the Elderlings. Now, this took what was a very kind of slow burn in the first book and just really went with all of these concepts. And even though there is a little bit of middle book syndrome here, the character development here was so magical that I have to include it this high on the list. There were these huge plot developments here that really wrapped me up in this world. I did feel like there were some pacing issues here, though, because there was a character that got introduced named Cirilla, who just bored me to tears. And every time this character got a POV, I just lost interest in the story. But then when it jumped away from this character, my interest just went up to 20 again. I just thought it was so well done. Now, what made me fall in love with this trilogy, and this book in particular, is that it took these characters and told me in the first book how I should feel about these characters. And it gave me a lot of reasons to do it, a lot of experiences that I got to go through that really established what I know about them and what I feel about them. And then in this book, it just tried to throw that all out the window and say, yeah, guess what? Human beings are more complex than that. These characters that you like, yeah, there's some bad things about them. These characters that you hate, yeah, there's some redemption arcs here. They're not all bad. You know, I think the two best examples of this would be Captain Kennett and Malta. Now, Captain Kennett, you had this guy that you view as this rogue, you know, who's got, you know, who doesn't, he kind of comes off as this bad guy, but he has these good traits about him. And ultimately, you know, it's like, is this guy a good guy or a bad guy? And in the second part of this trilogy here, there are these moments when you're like, yeah, I get it. He does have a point. He's just trying to do the right thing. His past is what's taught him to be the way he is. And then there's these critical moments where you're like, this man is straight evil. And you bounce between emotions with this character in such an amazing fashion that just makes him so real and lifelike and compelling as a character. And ultimately, you know, he's one of my favorite Realm of the Elderlings characters, and one of my favorite characters of all time, because of how compelling this character is. And, you know, I have my feelings about whether I liked or disliked this character. You'll have to hear about the final book in this trilogy much later on in the series, way later on in the series. It's one of my favorite books of all time. But needless to say, it's fun to watch this dynamic happen with this character. And the other character is Malta. And Malta is just insufferable in the first book. And she does these kind of bad things. She's not evil, but she's certainly very unlikable. Now in this book, I came to really feel compassion for this character. I ended up liking this character. And this character ends up a focal piece of more of the series that keeps going on, namely the Rainwild Chronicles that happened, you know, not the trilogy after this, but the quartet that follows that up. And yeah, I just love that I went from this kind of negative feeling about this character to a very positive one in a very believable fashion. You know, Robin Hobb, I've made no mistake about saying that I believe she's the greatest character writer in all of fantasy. She's one of the greatest character writers that have ever existed across any genre. And I think this is her best trilogy that she ever did. It's the best series of books that she's ever done. I love them dearly. I love the Realm of the Elderlings so much, but I have a special place in my heart for the Live Ship Traders. You know, I don't think people should skip the initial trilogy just to get here. I think you do need to read it for one critical reason that I'm not going to say. Readers that have finished this know what that reason is. But if you just hate the first trilogy and you're like, I can't do it, I'm never going to read this, if I go on, just skip it, read this one, enjoy it, read this for what it is. You don't even have to keep going. You could read this trilogy as an isolated book, an isolated series. It ties into the rest, but it is its own thing. And even without the Realm of the Elderlings, I believe that this trilogy is one of the greatest things that's ever been written, just on its own. You know, again, there is some middle book syndrome here, but there's so much to like about the way that this book was written that it is a must read for any fan of fantasy. And if you like nautical themes at all, if you like kind of a more pirate kind of book, man, this rocks. Number 41, and surprise, surprise, let's stick with the nautical theme again. I did not do this intentionally, it just kind of worked out that way. But this is The Lees of Laughter's End by Steven Erikson. This is part of the Tales of Botchelane and Corbel Brooch series written in 2007, and it is book 3 of 7. Now, you're probably scratching your head about what I just said, because very few people, even Malazan fans, know what this book is. It is very unknown. And man, it just spoke to me. This takes two very minor characters from the Malazan universe, from Malazan Book of the Fallen, in Memories of Ice. I think that's the only book that they show up in. Maybe they show up later, but I think that's the only book they show up in. And they're minor characters. And they get their own short story, or more like novella length series, these 7 books. And I think more may end up getting written, who knows, and it doesn't like just end on a note there. But this is all of the best parts of Terry Pratchett and his comedy, and straight up dark horror. And it's so weird to think that you could have a book that successfully blends horror and comedy into the same book and make it work, that it's just mind-blowing. And it really shows how special Steven Erikson is. It's one of the reasons that he's my favorite author of all time. And honestly, it's not that close. I think I would say the same thing if all I'd ever read was Malazan Book of the Fallen. But the fact that he can go into these different genres, and you can take somebody who can write the quality that he can write on the most epic scale series that's ever existed, but then go realize that he could be one of the funniest authors also that's ever existed, is crazy to me. I don't understand how a single man could be this gifted at writing, that he could take these two different genres and just absolutely demolish the competition. This is hysterical. It takes place, all of the book takes place on a boat. This is the book 3, but it's the second chronologically. I kind of suggest that you read these chronologically. Although you do kind of need to read at least up to book 3 in Malazan Book of the Fallen to really figure out what's up with these characters and what makes them tick. But there are these like necromancers that are so confident in their supreme abilities that they go around kind of unintentionally terrorizing people. And they get stuck on this boat with a group, kind of leaving one city and going to the next. And one of the guys accidentally or intentionally releases his child. And it is this freak abomination of a bunch of body parts all built up into one. And it's killing people left and right. And people are getting offed over and over again. I mean, you're reading this book and people are dying, these gruesome, bloody, horrible deaths. And I'm sitting there laughing my butt off, loving every single moment of it. There are just so many moments of this book where I legitimately was belly laughing. And these repeat jokes that kind of kept going on with different spins on them, the crazy situations that these characters found themselves in, that it's just this shock and awe and comedy all blending into this amazing concoction. And there's never been a book like this. Now, I don't think this book is for everybody. I think you have to have a very specific sense of humor. You've had to read a lot of books to get to this point. It is weird, and I don't understand why it just appealed to me so much. And I almost can't really recommend this book to a ton of people. But if anything that I'm saying appeals to you, and you've read Malazan Book of the Fallen, at least up to and through book 3, these books are short. Give them a shot. The first one sucks in my opinion. I do not like the first in this series. You do have to read it to really appreciate this one and understand why they're there. But you can burn through it. It's all set up, no execution at the end. And my confidence going into this was just, it couldn't have been lower. I was like, what did Steven Erikson do here? These books are horrible. And I was just blown away by what I read. So, and honestly, this isn't even my favorite in the series. You're going to see a book in the series higher up in the list later on. It might be next week. I'm not sure. I have to look over my list, but man, these rock. All right, that is the list. I cannot wait to talk to you next week about the next list of number 40 through 31. Man, these books just keep getting better and better, and I'm more passionate about these books as it goes along, and I just can't wait just to be able to talk to you about them and share some of my favorite books all time with you. I think I brutally failed in keeping this under 30 minutes, so sorry, I just think I'm not going to be able to do it. I talk too much. It is what it is. But thank you so much. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. If you haven't subscribed to Discord, please do so. I would love to chat with you directly, talk to you about these books, talk to you about the books you're reading, and just stay in touch. So thank you so much, and as always, happy reading to you.